Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Bernd Roeck. Bernd was the chair of General and Swiss History of Modern Times at the University of Zurich. He also taught there. He was the Dean of Faculty of Philosophy there, and he's been emeritus since 2019. He also was a director of German Studies Center in Venice, Italy, and he's taught at other universities such as the University of Augsburg and the University of Bonn. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, The World at First Light, A New History of the Renaissance. And that's what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about what the Renaissance gave to the modern world. We talk about the Renaissance and its connection with the so-called West, the 7 pillars of modernity that he outlines, and the impact that other civilizations, namely from the East, had on the Renaissance. We discuss the level of impact that ancient Greece and ancient Rome deserve on the Renaissance. We talk about Christianity in the West, the Islamic impact on the Renaissance, Western European marriage pattern, feudalism, origins of the university, and the importance of art during the Renaissance. We talk about the Gutenberg Press, New World discoveries, the High Renaissance, the importance of Socratic dialogue in the Renaissance. We touch briefly on the Ottoman Empire, Martin Luther and the Reformation, the Habsburgs, post-Renaissance, the Renaissance impact on the future, and many more topics. Now, as I mentioned in the conversation, Bernd's book is big. It is a almost 1,200-page tome. It's very good. It's very expansive. It covers a lot of ground. Very focused, obviously well written. As we mentioned in the conversation, he wrote it in German and it was translated, which is wonderful. And so by kind of nature, this conversation is almost 3 hours. I'm very, very happy of Bernd being generous with his time and energy. He had told me he recently had some medical procedures, so he was a little hoarse in the throat, which is totally fine. I sort of felt bad making him go that long, but he was great, and we had such a fun time talking about these topics of the Renaissance. And I told him, I said, if you're going to write 1,200 pages, you got to give me 3 hours to cover it. And he was so wonderful about that, and he really was a delight. I enjoyed my conversation with him. Lot of ground we cover. When I listened back to it, I was kind of actually surprised at, 3-hour conversations are long, and a lot of people don't talk about or listen to 3 hours of the Renaissance. But it feels very manageable. Like it's very, attainable to listen to, very easy to follow. It doesn't feel too in the weeds and doesn't feel too dry. And so I think he has such a wonderful knowledge base, but a way of expressing these things that are on the one hand, very rich with data, and on the other hand, very able to digest. So it's I think it makes for great conversation, and we got on well together. So he's just fantastic. Of course, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. Get over to the Substack, please, and subscribe. I know some people follow, that's fine, but subscribing is a bit better. You can get it in your inbox, you get the alerts, you get all the things. So please subscribe, share with your friends if they like good conversations, conversations I'm having. I have at this point an archive of different conversations on different topics, so there's something there for everyone. So share widely. And now I bring you Bernd Roeck. I am here with Bernd Roeck. Bernd, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's a big honor, big privilege. So I'm very excited to talk with you.
Thank you for the invitation. So I'm happy to speak with you.
Of course. Yes. As I was telling you before we started, you have written an absolute masterpiece. You have the new book just out called The World at First Light, A New History of the Renaissance. And I'll just tell listeners this is a almost 1,200 page book. It's a tome of a book. It is a masterpiece, though. And I'll just say a lot of the times people have a bunch of like endnotes and footnotes, which you also do. But about reading material, it is just about 1,000 pages. So it's fantastic. I greatly enjoyed reading it, and so we'll talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners a brief snapshot of who you are, professionally, academically, and then we'll talk about the book.
I started at Munich in Bavaria with the Ludwig Maximilians University and studied history and politics. And then I was for some years a journalist and worked in Venice as director of the Centro Tedesco di Studi Veneziani. It's a German institute for Venetian studies. 4 years. It was a privilege. And then I got a job at the University of Bonn. It's an important university. And I finished there with the job of a Secretary General of a Center of Excellence, the Villa Vigoni in Italy, at the Lake of Como. If you read David Lodge, Changing Places, you will meet the places where I was there. And after Villa Vigoni, after Italy again, I got a job in Zurich, in Switzerland. And I'm still until today as a professor for modern history. And I resigned in 2019, and now I have enough time to read or write books.
Well, you're taking all of that, all of those years of wisdom and experience, and now you're giving it back to everybody in your book. So that's wonderful. That's also very, very, very nice that you're able to do that. Now, let me ask. Let me make sure if I'm right here. This book, the new one that you have here, is The World at First Light. It says translated by Patrick Baker. Shout out to Patrick Baker. Now, you wrote this in originally German? Did you?
In German, yes.
The original language? Okay.
Yes, German.
And so then, did you write any of it in English, or you had Patrick write it in English? And what was the process, I guess, between you and him on the English version?
Patrick was a brilliant translator, and we had a very strong contact. We spoke about some words and some special problems, but the book is his. He was a translator. My English is modest, as you hear, and I have no experience with the English-speaking world. So I was very happy to have a translator, as Patrick was now. And we had a collaboration of, I think, 5 or 6 years. And he organized a seminar. He held a seminar at the Berlin University. And with his students, he spoke 2 semesters only about my book. And at the end, we had a discussion about the translation, about the contents, of course. Oh, it was a very good cooperation. He's a Renaissance specialist too. He's not only a translator, he's a historian. And it was very useful.
That's really, really nice. I can't imagine 5 or 6 years with my own book, much less somebody else's book, and that's quite amazing. That's really, really nice. Okay, so I mean, where to begin? Did you initially set out to I mean, was this a pandemic book? I guess a lot of people had those, but did you set out to write so much? I mean, was it, I want to write, a new history of the Renaissance, but then as you started getting into it, you said, I need to add this and let me put a lot of background and add things here? Or how did it start to, I don't think people choose to say, I'm going to write, 1,000 or 1,100 pages necessarily, but yeah, how did you come to write it in this way with so much detail?
So it's a long story, but the point was that this book is financed by his foundation, the Henkel Foundation, and so I had the freedom to write a lot and had the freedom to put in illustrations, So this was the first point, that I had enough space, enough time to write it, and then I saw that if you want to write a book about the Renaissance, you can't write a new edition of Jakob Burckhardt's famous culture of or the civilization of the Renaissance, or a story of Italian Renaissance, something like that. So it's important to compare the culture of the Renaissance with other cultures and to write a global history of innovations at the beginning of modernity. This was the idea. And of course, it was quite complicated to do the research, and you had to have a lot of space to get it printed, what you discovered. So this was the idea, to write absolutely a new vision on the Renaissance. And this meant that you had to compare it with other parts of the world. There's a point that if you are a mathematician or something like that, you have to make career if you're very young, between 20 and 30. As a historian, it's good if you're 60 or 70, because you have a lot of experience, you learned a lot, and you have a lot in your library, in your head. This was a point that I could write this book. I was always very interested in the history of Renaissance, but more from a point of view as a cultural historian, as an art historian. So I wrote a book about Piero della Francesca's flagellation, a new discovery, a new discovered source. And so it's an entire book about one of the most fascinating paintings of the Renaissance. And I wrote a book about a Renaissance architect. And so art and architecture were for me the door openers, the openness for the history of the Renaissance. But to write a book about the discoveries, the new discoveries, and the special role of the West, this was new, and this was my ambition.
Yeah, no, I mean, you absolutely land it, and you do a fabulous job. I do see understanding culture and understanding the Renaissance through art. I mean, obviously, it was a really big deal. You talk about it lots in the middle of the book. I think there's a few German philosophers. Nietzsche is one of them. It said that most of all of truth comes through art. There's something so wonderful about understanding art and the truth that comes out of it. And so, other people have said similar things. So I do appreciate that lens. So I guess the one big question here for people that don't know about the Renaissance is, you can kind of give us the overview of, if you want, of what it was and stuff. But my question here is many people point to the Renaissance as this, and you mentioned it as well, it's this period of having a dialogue about the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and practices that really kind of sets the modern world on its course. I mean, it really is, these things are taking place, in 15th, 16th century, et cetera, and throughout. But most people see modernity as around, I mean, there's no real starting point, I guess people fight about this, but 1800 or so, and then until current. I guess we're in a postmodern period. But and a lot of this comes into play. What do you make about generally? We'll certainly talk about the global sphere of it, because I think that's I really love how you took that approach. But yeah, this discursive revolution, modernity, the West, all of these things. I guess, what did the Renaissance give to the modern world with ideas and knowledge and practice and things of this sort?
You're completely right that normally if somebody wants to explain the so-called rise of the West, or the special position of the West in world history, the discovery was research starts in the 18th century with industrialization, maybe with the scientific revolution in the 17th century. But my goal was to explain why the scientific revolution, the so-called scientific revolution, and then the industrialization could take place in Europe and in the West, and our Western phenomenon. I say that it was not necessary, but that in the West we find a space of possibilities where it could develop. It had not to develop, but it could develop. And I think if you want to explain the modernity with looking to the 18th and 19th century, then you cannot understand why it was especially in Europe. And so, for me, the Renaissance is an essential part of this story, of the rise of the West. In a certain sense, I think you could have called my book too The Renaissance and the Rise of the West. So
Mm,
it's a
mm.
central problem because I think that the developments in the Renaissance, especially the Socratic dialogue, maybe we speak about that still, was essential for the special situation we find in the Western world.
It's an interesting thing because I'll bring it up here because I'm sure we'll talk about it throughout the conversation. But there's been a lot of discussion recently about the West, this term, this idea now. Now, one of the things I like about your book and how your lens is that you're gonna plant us where it fits, how the lead up to it, the influences of that, and then, but what was the fertile ground of sorts for all of the things in the Renaissance which came out of that. But there is a sort of, how do I say this? A lot of historians have, for many, many centuries, have really, I think, overemphasize this idea of the West and what the history of it is. As it's become a more broader term. You think about, in World War II, it was, the saving Western culture and all these things, and so it's kind of become a sort of colloquialism of sorts that is in everybody's vernacular. So you have people like Josephine Quinn, who's wrote about the idea of the West. You have, Walter Scheidel, who wrote, who's written about, obviously about the Roman period, but, what is the West? How do we understand it? And then also you have folks like Georgios Varoufakis, who wrote this whole new history on the West. So many people have been reconsidering or trying to reestablish what have we meant by the West? What are some of its origins? And of course, everyone's got its different lenses. And so, I guess for you, how are you seeing the evolution of this idea or this term? And how do we understand its sort of place and where it kind of sits of having all of these interactions from the East or transporting of ideas through the Mediterranean at a certain time and throughout Europe? Most people focus on, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, which is fair, but these ideas of those places came from other places too. Just generally, how do you understand this idea of reconsidering what we think about origins of the West and how it's evolved over time?
Let me make one thing clear. Of course, I don't write about the West as the best of all
Hmm.
worlds. Of course, I don't. I speak about the dark sides of the West too, from the confessional conflicts to the wars of religion to colonialism and witch hunting and so
Hmm.
on. That's the
Yeah.
first, that I don't see an ideal West. I see the West as it is. And I say that the
Hmm.
rise of the West, first point, is a very complicated story. And this complicated story means to look to cultural exchange, to look to the um, to the long time, to the long periods when it developed. And I say that a very central point is that we today maybe learn again what the West means, our West, not
Mm,
the global South, not
mm,
China, not Russia,
mm,
but the West, democracies, public opinion, universities where you can say and teach what you want, museums where you
mm,
can show what you want. You can tell
mm,
stories or this history, how it was, not how it should be. No, the
mm,
West is today through. You know that there are many, many problems to maintain this
mm,
situation. Some Maybe you know it in America better than we in Europe today, but we have similar problems. And
Yeah.
so I think it's worth to speak about the values of the West and the values of the human rights and the values of democracy. And I presume that the contribution of the Renaissance to these developments and to this world of worth, or this world of human rights, and this democratic institution, that the contribution of the Renaissance was very, very important. That's the central point of my argument.
Mm, mm. I think that that's right. I think that while there are many, like anywhere, I mean, this is where I think when people start to flatten certain ideas, it becomes, not fully. It becomes a little too parochial. But obviously, cultures and civilizations around the world have had many ups and downs and many challenges. But I do think it is fair to say, just as you say, we you discuss it and write about it as it is. There are negative and dark chapters, and there are some really bright moments that have given a lot of things, and so you do lots of that. Now tell us, you kind of in the beginning you kind of outline kind of where the book is going and stuff, and so this will be good to kind of just kind of set the table, if you will. You talk about these 7 pillars of modernity. You don't have to talk about all 7, but maybe you can just kind of go on a little bit about this. You talk about number 1, geography and climate; 2, political and cultural competition; 3, urban middle classes; 4, containment of religion; 5, critical dialogue with ancient and Arabic philosophy and science; 6, the media revolution, mostly with the printing press; and 7, the long periods of time, which is something that you emphasize at the end of the book as well. These kind of pillars, well, really kind of give you the for listeners and readers, that's sort of the loose outline of the book and how you follow things, which is nice. But yeah, tell us just generally how these 7 pillars of modernity have impacted the rest of the world.
So, in brief, a summary of 1,000 pages.
Yes.
Now, first, geography. For me, important was Jerry Diamond with his series about the significance
Hmm.
of geography. It's one factor, it's not the decisive point, but of course, you have a climate which is permitting to cultivate many different plants and to have different animals, from horses, starting with horses. For example, you
Hmm.
don't find horses in South America, but you find it in the West, and you find it in Europe. No? And geography means that it's easier to cultivate grain and to cultivate certain plants in a moderate climate, and not in the Arctic, and not in the cold, not in the heat of the desert. It's very simple. You have
Hmm.
the situation with the Mediterranean, so you have good connections with the different political entities. Let us say not states, maybe growing, developing states. That means that you have different possibilities to escape if you have a problem somewhere. You can write things against your government and you can go from one city to the other. And you are, as you cannot do in China. China, everything
Hmm.
is decided in Beijing in a certain time.
Yeah.
But you
Hmm.
have a lot of countries with own economies, with own governments, and you have a geographic situation with rivers and with the oceans, Mediterranean, Atlantic Ocean, uh, which means that you have a always flowering communication between the elites, between the scientists, between the peoples of these countries, of these different countries. And you have different countries, that means competition. Competition means that may mean war, but war is only one factor. It can mean that you want to have the more beautiful paint, more beautiful castles, better architecture, the better agriculture. You want to earn more money. So competition means that you find always people looking for innovations. And if you pay these people for the innovations, you will have someday more people looking for innovation, trying to innovate something, to invent something. So competition is very important, and geography too, because geography, European geography, facilitates it to communicate about these developments. Urban middle classes. It's a very interesting point, and it's very difficult to explain why we find these middle classes in the Western world and not elsewhere. I think it has something to do with the marriage pattern, with the fact that you have not the kinship deciding about your marriage, but you have a European marriage pattern as we know today, until today, father, mother, children. And then that means social mobility in the West is greater than elsewhere. But I'm not sure whether this is enough. That's a good explanation, because I'm not a specialist in these demographic problems. But it's clear that the middle classes, you don't find these middle classes in other countries, in other cultures. Reading people with a certain economic basis, with money to buy books, money to visit universities, and not only to work at home. These middle classes you don't find in Africa, you don't find in many Asian countries, but you find it in Europe, in every city more or less. So middle classes are very important, urban middle classes. All the great artists, many of the inventors, many of the intellectuals have a social origin in the middle class. And so this is a very, very important point. And I wrote Containment of Religion. You have only to look to the Islamic world, to the Houthi, to Tehran, to understand what it means that in a long and bloody fight in Europe, religion was contained. You find the first beginnings just in the 10th, 11th century, and then in the wars of religion where huge armies fought against each other in the name of the same God. So it was a lecture that tolerance is better, and tolerance is the only way out of these conflicts. Tolerance is a very, very important economic value. In tolerant countries, it's easier to sell goods, to produce goods, than in parts where you have a rigid religious government. And then the critical dialogue in a world where religion is not at the top of society and can decide about everything, what could be discussed and what should be believed. The critical dialogue we learned from the Greeks and from the Romans is a very important point. We can speak about that today. In every democracy, you find the critical dialogue as an everyday life phenomenon. You find it in television, you find it in parliaments, you find it in policy and so on. And you don't find it in, for example, Beijing, and you don't find it in Tehran. No? And to be connected with this in developments is the media revolution. Gutenberg's famous discovery, not only movable types, but the screw press, a certain press which the Chinese, for example, didn't have. And the Chinese had the problems that they have word signs. They have not letters, not an alphabet as we have. So the printing press was less useful in the Chinese world. But with the printing press, it's maybe the most important invention in 1,000 years. Scientists in all over the continent were able, all over the culture, the European culture, were able to communicate, to speak about their ideas and to improve ideas. And they had time, no invasions. And if we speak about the Mongols, the Mongolian Empire, we can say that was a very positive fact, that it was possible to defend Europe against the impact of the Mongolian invasion.
You mentioned, well, it's nicely done. You hit all 7 points. I think towards the end you say the most important characteristic of the European Renaissance, the core of its identity, was the gargantuan range of its thought and also the amount of time it had. And you really just illustrated that. Is you have people in a particular region for hundreds of years refining and trying to understand many of these things. The Renaissance is, a good, 200, 250 years in a place with time and to really iron these things out. And that's, in a sense, when you look at it that way, it's special in a sense, meaning it's a sort of a special moment in time to be able to do that. It's not, they're not the only folks to do that, but it is an interesting thing to think about. Everything that came before it is now impacted at this sort of point to then spur out, all of these other things we have, even that we feel today, many of the things you just mentioned. So let me ask this. You mentioned that Renaissance is really a kind of definitionally a rebirth of sorts. And Central Europe is at this sort of nexus point of the East and the Fertile Crescent, and that's a huge part. I guess the big question here, we'll talk briefly about Greece and Rome for a minute, but how much does the Renaissance, maybe I don't say need to give credit, but how much do they pull from the Indus Valley and many of the civilizations there in India, from the Ottomans, from the Mongols, from many places in China, many places out in the East, so to speak? As you have trade, trade is goods, but trade is also culture and peoples and ideas across the Mediterranean. So you can think of places like modern day Turkey and Greece and Macedonia and Bulgaria, all these places that filters into the rest of Europe. Let me ask it in a simpler, better way. Do we get the Renaissance if we don't have some of the history and lead up from ideas of the East and everything like that? How much of that impact is in the Renaissance?
Much. We cannot understand the Renaissance if we don't see that there was a great and very important cultural exchange. The Renaissance was not only European, the Renaissance was Asian. It was, for example, the system of decimal numbers with a very important zero was an Indian invention and was brought by Arab merchants to North Africa, where the Italians learned it in the 12th century. So, for example, you have an invention hundreds and hundreds years ago. It was brought to Europe in the high medieval times. And without this system of decimal system, the scientific evolution, I think, would have been impossible. This is only one example. Other examples you find a lot if you look to the exchange with the Arabic world. The Arabs collected antique texts written by Aristotle, written by Plato, and so on. And they copied it, translated it from Greek into Arab, and the Italians learned it from the Arabs and translated it again into Italian or into Latin. So cultural exchange is always important. I don't know any culture until today which has not been result of a intensive, more or less intense cultural exchange. So the Renaissance you cannot understand without looking to the East and looking to the Arabic world.
Why do you think we don't, or for many years, why do you think we don't have that kind of 360 view? Why don't we say, look, the Renaissance did so many wonderful things, but let's also say the impact and the influence. It seems that the Arab influence or the Indian influence or things like that gets, a footnote or sidelined or not spoken about at all. And obviously, your work and others people's work has tried to really highlight that. But for many many years, we didn't hear that part of the story. Is that
Yeah.
maybe not for everybody, but is that an intentional thing, or do you think it's just being short sighted? Why do we not hear this? I mean, it's changing, but why do we not hear this as much?
No, you're right. But it's very complicated. Who can speak Chinese or Arab? So I gave
Mm,
my chapters. I wrote about the Arabic world and about China and
yeah.
Japan and so on to specialists, to friends who read it and said, "Okay,
Mm,
that's right. Yeah, there you have to correct something." But the
mm,
things that we have today, internet, we have very easy possibilities to read uh, texts, distant texts in distant libraries. But this was not so easy for Jakob Burckhardt. And Jakob Burckhardt didn't have context to the Sinologists or people who spoke Arab and so on. This is a point.
mm,
It's simply very difficult to write a book like this without having the possibilities of communication we have today. This is
mm,
one point.
mm,
Another point I think is more problematic, that you find sometimes the idea that the European miracle is a consequence of the European race. That's
mm,
something like a European race, which was stronger and better than the rest of the world. Of course, you
mm,
find this in the Nazi era in Germany in a
mhm.
very horrible way. But
Yeah.
until today, sometimes you find that Europeans are more intelligent, better people than people elsewhere. And this is, of course,
Mm,
totally wrong. It's not true.
mm. Yeah. 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 I mean, I think it is interesting to see. I mean, obviously those ideas are latent with other ideas that are obviously false, but it is interesting to see how so much of different places are influenced by all these other places in the world, and it is nice to see many folks seeing and recognizing this. So okay, so we don't have to spend too much time on it, but look, ancient Greece is super important, um, and I think there's what I learned when I was in school at various points was ancient Greece, ancient Greece, right? That they created everything, right? They created democracy, they created they created the dialogue, they created all of these different things, philosophy and all these things, and for sure the ancient Greeks have a major stamp on the quote unquote the Western world. But how much does ancient Greece owe to its concepts and ideas to the East and other parts of the world? Greece is in the Mediterranean. It's more. It's a lot closer to North Africa and to the Levant and all these other places. I mean, is it? Look, I mean, I don't want to undermine it. I mean, I think one of the things you mentioned, which I do think is you know, kind of, the Greek kind of thing, is this emphasis of critical dialogue, which you had mentioned, which we still use today. You and I are using it now. It's not that people before them didn't have it, but it's the fact that they really operationalized it, or made this a kind of structure, or made it a kind of element of daily living in some ways that makes sense. But yeah, how much do we give ancient Greece some of its due? But how much is it fair to say, yeah, ancient Greece was getting lots of their ideas, as you're saying, through this cultural exchange in and out of the Mediterranean, taking things from the East, all these things. What's the story there, and how does that spring us to how the Renaissance used ancient Greek
Mm,
ideas?
Yeah, but I'm not a specialist, of course, for these things. But there was
Sure.
published a book, Black Athena, and this
Mm,
book discovered and underlined the point that, of course, the Greek philosophers learned a lot from Africa, from old Egypt,
mm,
from
mm,
the astronomic point problems until to the arts. And uh, the only point is that we understand and have the theory of democracy, a reality of democracy, just in the 5th, 4th century before Christ, Antichrist. So in the time of Demosthenes and Platon and Aristotle and so on. So it's the first time we have written sources with a theory of democracy. That's really the beginning. And this doesn't mean that I would neglect the fact that the Greeks learned a lot from other cultures. Only we don't have the sources to explain it until the last details. Of course, they learned a lot from Africa. They learned a lot from Asia. But it's clear that in the light of history, in the light of the sources, we find it in the world of the Greek, of the Greek cities from Athena to Sparta and so on. On the agora, on the marketplace, later the forum in Rome, there were discussions, public discussions, first manifestations, what we now call democracy.
And how do you, I mean, this is a bit getting ahead, but how do you feel those components of ancient Greece started to influence or impact the big period of the Renaissance? You know, what are the folks from in Italy and Venice and, you know, the 15th century, 16th century pulling from ancient Greece, you know, whether it's with art or whether it's through other forms of culture? What do you see as the influence there?
I say in my book, and then starting with the Galilei dialogue, the dialogue about two world systems. Now, the famous dialogue he wrote in to defend the Copernican view of the universe. I start with this dialogue because it's a fantastic example how the scientific revolution learned how to argue, how to discuss scientific problems, learned from the Greeks. This is a part of the old Platonic dialogue. We always forget that discussions like this and a dialogue like the famous dialogue of Galilei about the most important world systems, that this text is a specific Western text. You don't find this kind of argumentation, this kind of clearing something of coming closer to truth. No? That this is a sexuality we learned from the Greeks. You can't find it, for example, in China. Until today, I have the impression that it's a great difference to discuss problems in the Western world and in Asia. When I had to organize a panel in China, but I must say in Taiwan, not in mainland China, we had a discussion about human rights. And my idea was that human rights are universal. You don't find Asian human rights. You don't find specific human rights. Human rights are human rights and they are universal. We had a long discussion. It was a normal discussion as you have it in every seminar in your university, DC or somewhere. No? But at the end of the discussion, there came 3 students to my table. We had a dinner, a conference dinner, and they brought me 3 glasses of wine and a glass of wine and said, Professor Roeck, we want to honor you. We want to excuse ourselves because you have been attacked in the discussion. You have been attacked. And, I was, of course, I'm an old man, but it was a normal discussion. And they want to excuse themselves because I was attacked. By the way, this is sometimes in Switzerland similar. You don't interrupt people speaking. So I say, Switzerland, this point of view is a little bit more Chinese than Germany, for example. So, but I want to say that this culture of discussion you find not elsewhere in the world, not everywhere. Have a look to Russia today. Have a look to Beijing today. Where is people speaking about everything, about understanding that good doubt is better than a believed truth? Doubting is better than
Yeah.
believing. No? And this is
Yeah. Yeah.
you can learn reading the Socratic dialogue. The first
Mm-hmm.
example for this kind of discussion, the everyday life of any democracy, it's normal. That's the reason why we don't see that it was a great invention and a great progress.
Yeah, no, you really describe it well and give examples of where it's a bit different in the world based on their long histories and culture. And I wonder if there's what is it about Greece or maybe the Aegean region specifically? Is it the good sun over there? They have, they have a lot of olive trees over there. What is it? What was it about that period of Greece? Is there a kind of maybe embedded cultural thing where they're more, the stereotype is they're, very passionate and very expressive. Is there just something in that then they kind of formalize? I wonder, and again, they're not the only, many people in Latin America are that way too, very expressive and passionate things. But I wonder what it was about that time and maybe some of the embedded cultural things that said, hey, let's dialogue about this. Let's have constructive conversation here. I wonder about that.
Yeah, you discovered really a problem of my book. Then I had the idea that the real one of the great mysteries of history is why Greece? Why Greece? Why is Greece so important, and why developed democracy and a new science, a new kind of discussion? No, why Greece? And I spoke about the problem with friends. You could speak with Walter Scheidler at Stanford or somewhere, and I think that's a great mystery until today. We could speak about the Mediterranean world. Again, the competition between city-states, republics, the good weather, in a rainy world. The marketplace is not so important as the agora was in Greece, where you have sun, can discuss things, sell things, and so on. But you are right. The great mystery is Greece. And to explain the great mystery, one should write a book with 2,000 pages.
That's right. Well, maybe.
And I'm not sure whether he can explain it.
Yeah, I mean, when I talked to Scheidel, he was on the podcast a couple months ago. Yeah, we talked about, we kind of briefly touched at it, and it is a sort of mystery about where these things, kind of what was going on there in Greece, and so I mean, it is a beautiful part of the world, so for sure. So a sort of similar question here is Rome. So again, there's many people that have written about the Roman Republic, and then the Empire, and then you have the Byzantine Empire. We'll talk a little bit more about all those things, but the Roman Empire lasted a long time. I think a lot of people will give it, till the Ottomans, right? 1453 or 58 or whatever it is. That was truly it was done. But some people say 80, 70, whatever. It doesn't, there's importance here, but there is things about the Roman Empire. Obviously, you have the East-West later on that splits, and that's, I think, where some of the origins of the idea of West comes, is the Western Empire. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, there was huge impact of the Greeks on the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. But I guess the essential question here, I mean, obviously, many people have written about the Romans. But what made the Roman Empire universal, I think, is the claim that you make, right? And that there is a sort of universality. Obviously, it was very big. It wasn't the biggest empire. I mean, again, Mongols, Ottomans, they were also very large empires. But what made the Roman Empire universal, and how do you see this sort of dichotomy of Christianity in the Roman Empire? Definitely with after Constantine in 23, 26. And then, of course, you have many of the Byzantine empires, Justinian, etc. So, yeah, there was the Roman Empire's universal, and then Christianity becomes this honey and poison of sorts, as you say, for the Roman Empire. Tell us about that.
Okay, the Roman Empire to explain why it rose and why it fell is a very complicated story. And there's a recent book about the Roman Empire where the author only lists for 3 pages, only with one sentence or with a series about the fall of the Roman Empire. 3 or 4 pages, only some words about this complicated problem.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first point is that the Roman Empire was always pattern for a great empire for until the United States in the 20th century. The Roman Empire maybe never realized pattern possibility to not only to be great for some time, but to be a great, well organized state for hundreds of years. That's the point. Not only for a short time, but the only example for an empire, well ordered empire. I mean, on his high times in the second century, there were no enemies. It was too great. It was too big. From the Euphrates to Spain, from Scotland to North Africa, there was only the Roman Empire in the known world. So the imperial structure is one fascinating point. The other is the republican reality, this possibility to organize a state, not let us say it was far away from a modern democracy, but republican Rome created patterns of political behavior. You find still, and I mentioned this in my book, in the Federalist Papers, his famous texts written in the 18th century, Alexander Hamilton and others, to discuss the American Constitution. So you find still traces of the Roman Republic in the American Constitution until today. Another point is Roman law. The Roman law was a fantastic and very important discovery. Again, it's a long discussion why it developed. Maybe we can speak about that. But why the Roman law, a rational law, first law, which was not only based on the belief to God and to luck, and also, as you know, this is not very rational laws and rational right you find in the early modern times, where the Roman law was not spread. No? But this very rational and very important discovery in Bologna and in other universities, and important for the history of the Renaissance. Then, of course, the Roman philosophy and the fact that the Roman culture integrated and transported Greek thought, that the late Roman Empire was fascinated by the Greeks. And so it was a very important mediator for the Greek thought between antique times and medieval times. You could say many more about Roman developments in Roman culture, Roman architecture, the Renaissance architecture, the Renaissance sculpture. You cannot imagine without knowledge of the Roman patterns, the Roman examples. No, but so Rome was a mediator, was a cultural factor of primary importance.
Yeah, and I think that there's again an interesting piece of this here of how much they really pushed out and developed that, as to your point, we're still using today, even in some ways. And I think in terms of looking at, the U.S. example is a very, very young in historical framework, a federated republican democratic, all of those things have more. I mean, somewhat. I want to say a direct link, but the founding fathers, so to speak, of the U.S. were very, very influenced, well read on Roman and Greek, but Roman ways of doing law and organizing things. And I'm sure, as we'll discuss, this spread into Europe as well. So there is obviously a huge impact on what we do even now in modernity in terms of law and organizing the polis and all of these things. So this is very instrumental, certainly. But I guess the religious piece here is you start to see Christianity and how it was used in the Roman Empire. And, as you get through the centuries, you start, we can get up to the point where we're talking about the migration period where people are coming in and out of Europe. This Christianization of Europe initially was a top-down affair, and you start to get this monasticism that starts to spread. But how did, of all the ideas, Christianity, I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, you can't understate the importance of Constantine and, Constantinople and all these things. You can't underestimate that, we're talking in the 4th century this happens. And so you have centuries of this, and you have folks like Justinian in the 6th century really codifying Christian kinds of dogma into law and how we do things. So you can't understate it enough. But even still, when you have different people groups and things across Europe as you go through the centuries, how was this Christianization such a top-down affair throughout Europe?
So it's the reason why I call this development poison and honey, because you find positive aspects, and if you read the Bible, you find very love as a very central factor of human human culture. It's a love in the center. Christianity is a religion of love, you can say, but it's always a religion, a monotheistic religion, not accepting the coexistence with other religions. That means you find love as one important point in the Bible, but you find intolerance as another development which came with Christianity into Europe. And the climax, the crisis, you find in the 16th and 17th centuries with the wars of religion. That's the reason why I say poison. And the wars of religion were Christianity, a Christian affair. So the Protestants, the Calvinists, the Catholics, the most important confessions were Christian denominations. No? So you find this humanistic concept of love coming with Christ to earth, if you want to say this so. On the one side, on the other side, the monotheistic absolutism and the monotheistic intolerance.
There's another interesting thing here. This is sort of a kind of rejoinder, I guess, to this idea. So I'll bring it here. But many people have, I believe, overemphasized, but I think it's obviously important. So you have folks like Tom Holland. He's great. He's very nice. I've chatted with him here as well. He's great. And he wrote the big book Dominion, which became a bit popularized, and really just his argument, is saying how the influence of Christianity on many things, including the West and the ideas. But now you have, I don't know how much you've heard of this, but there are some people that have this very pedestrian cartoon version of this, where it says, well, if you want to really hold Western values, you just need to be a Christian. Because we don't get Western values unless you have Christianity, almost as if it's a prerequisite to have Western values of rule of law and free speech and, democratic ideas and human rights and all these things. You need to basically believe in Jesus and the Bible and Christianity and whatever that version is. And to me, that's a very, again, kind of cartoon version of this. And my idea, and I want to know what your idea is here, is I think you have so much in the Renaissance, in the scientific revolution, in many of these different periods, this emphasis, and you talk about it in the book, so we don't have to get deep into it. We'll get there, but this emphasis on the individual and this emphasis on humanism. It's less of how do you have this reverence for a deity, and that's where we're going to get ideas. Yes, you're right. Christianity has a lot of emphasis on loving your neighbor and all these things. It also has some terrible things too. But even outside of that, there is still a dogma and doctrine of you have to worship a deity, you have to live your life according to a book, and all these rules and all these things. And I find that much of the thought outside of this is within the Renaissance, within kind of modernity and all these things, is this emphasis on humanism and human potential. And some of that is individualism, and there's other pieces of it that are on other components. What do you think about this idea of, and I'm not saying that Tom does this, he doesn't do that. He I think he treats it pretty balanced. I'm saying other people have kind of taken off on that and done some version that's weird. But what do you think about this idea of you only get Western values or all these ideas, that some of it is from the Renaissance. You have to be Christian, or you have to have some piece of that because they're inseparable. It's a prerequisite. What do you make of this?
I'm not convinced that this is true. I have to say, I personally am not a Christian. I have a very free kind of seeing religious problems. But of course, you find in the Bible wonderful sentences, wonderful words and truth. But you find horrible things too. You find,
of course.
So just Jesus says one day, I don't think I came only with peace. I came with a sword too. And this is, but I think if you have the freedom of seeing the positive things in the Bible, positive things in the Christian theology, then you are free to take other positive things from the Enlightenment too, from enlightened philosophers. From Montaigne, I think he's one of the first really philosophers of the Enlightenment, to Rousseau and to Montesquieu and many others. So Europeans should not be only Christians. They can be Christians, but should see the dark sides of a religion which is not tolerant against others, and should see that the tolerance as a central point of Kant's definition of enlightenment is a very important value, useful and economically important until today. Things like this, we could say that as Christianity is a heritage, enlightenment is the same. Is an heritage too, and not only an atheistic enlightenment. We have a Christian enlightenment too, a Catholic enlightenment in Bavaria, for example. So again, you see that I'm appreciating the exchange between different ways of thought, different philosophies, different approaches. You have to be eclectic. Not only to be a Christian, not only a secularized, enlightened philosopher. You have to find everywhere what's good and what's helpful to live together.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. So the new kid on the scene, so to speak, is Islam. You see Islam in the 7th century arise, and very quickly, have some big military wins, and out of Arabia into Syria, into Iraq, and then off into the world. And of course, you had the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties, and you get the 3 kind of caliphates in the year 1000. I guess, how much did Islam bring more ideas to the world and to Europe Not just Arab ideas or not just other parts of the world, other regions, Syrian or otherwise. It's Islam. Islam did it. There was a spread of this. Anyway, obviously, you get to the Iberian Peninsula in Portugal and Spain, and you have kind of one of the three that are there. Charlemagne is huge here. You talk about Charlemagne and the Renaissance. For this kind of scholasticism. But yeah, how did Muslim conquest in the starting really in the late 7th century all the way up until probably around the 11th or 12th century. How did these conquests really create this massive economic zone in world history as well?
I think that you have first to look to small things like, for example, the Indian numbers, the decimal system, the zero. I just mentioned it. But on the other hand, you have to see that there was a lot of knowledge of Eastern knowledge in the Islamic, Arabic medicine. So it was so important for the West to learn from the Arab doctors, from the Arab physicians, what the human life is made of. On the other hand, Islam was never very tolerant, and it was never favored never democracy. It was democracy was a negative form of living together. On the other hand, there were many Islamic, Arabic philosophers, many translating, as I said, antique texts, antique philosophers. And for the West, it was essential that the Islamic thinkers preserved all these things for Western thought, and could be copied, could be translated.
Also, in this period, we see, you mentioned this, briefly, is India and China and Japan and larger Asian civilizations. They were doing some things in this period as well. I mean, obviously, there's a big, kind of how we talk about world history of sorts, as people kind of center in on how things are connected or wars or things like that. But there are other things going on as well. And these places in Asia, India, China, Japan, they've had established civilizations and established intellectual and cultural life before the European Renaissance. I guess, maybe it is through, obviously much has been said about the Silk Roads, obviously maybe from India as well. You have, sort of, Dalrymple's Golden Road with trade and the way that people would bring things on ships and things like that throughout, the Asia and then out into the Mediterranean and off to Europe. But what do you think in these places in Asia where there was established civilizations, what did they kind of, by some sort of medium, whatever that is, a trade or whatever, that they also brought, or the impact of their established intellectual and cultural life influenced the European Renaissance as it was starting to kind of kick up in the 11th and 12th century?
I think you find only the strongest encounters between the Arabic world and the Christian world in Spain. But there's another point. I'm not so sure whether there was a lot of things the West learned from China, for example. China was far away, and China was, of course, discovered by merchants. Marco Polo is the most famous. But I think the reality was that China hadn't enough time to develop similar scientific breakthroughs as you find it in the Western world. Just in the 12th, 13th century, you have invasions. You have always the necessity to strengthen the military power of of China, and you have not a lot of centers we find in the European world, as that we have in Europe, many states and city-states and republics in competition. You don't have this in China. If there's a civil war and destructs Beijing or another city, then there's finished with intellectual life. And you cannot develop new inventions, new things. This was a great difference between China and Europe. Europe was free from the Mongols, China not. China had a Mongolian period with a very hard and restrictive government. And you find the same in many African states, not everywhere, but this quantity of different states surviving the disasters of invasions, as you find it in Europe, you find not in other parts of the world.
It's very interesting how what kind of gets through and gets, if you will, transported or seen, and other things that don't. And so it's very, very interesting.
And
You
then
know, go ahead.
No, takes another point is a famous Malthusian trap. No, this is a point where I say I have an idea, but I cannot prove it. That the rice economy in Asia. No,
Yeah.
with rice you can. It's easier to maintain a great population with the same quantity of land, with the same surface. You cannot produce a grain for millions of people as you could do it with rice in China. That means that disease at the end, a disease catastrophe in China is heavier than in the West. And it's difficult, and you have to find ways to avoid it. So the question to escape the Malthusian trap in China is always more important than in the West. And it was more important for the decisions of the government, for all decisions of the governments. And Europe's rice economy you have not. Your people is living with bread and grain, and the cities are smaller. Beijing had a million inhabitants. You don't find any city in Europe. The greatest city in the Roman Empire in the 16th century was Cologne, with 400,000 inhabitants. See, and so you have more freedom, not to organize food, but to organize universities. If I say it very briefly, with one word.
That's a very interesting point. Again, that's something that the global perspective here helps you understand a little bit of these things. That's not something I would have probably thought about in thinking about these things. But yeah, it goes back to your point in the beginning we said about time, which is instructive. So briefly here, in the year 1000, the AD, you talk about agriculture production in Europe, it became a big thing as kind of things you were mentioning there in Asia. But in Europe, the agriculture was interesting. But I think you mentioned it earlier. There was a kind of this unique demographic structure, which I think was kind of into your urban middle class thing, was this Western European marriage pattern, which I thought was interesting. Maybe you talk about how there's something. We'll talk about feudalism in a minute, but how does that kind of arise, and how is there sort of a sort of uniqueness to it in some sense?
This marriage pattern was discovered by Heinal. Heinal is a historian, demographic historian, and he said that there's a great difference, the line, if you take from St. Petersburg down to Athens, to Greece. No? Then you have on the West, the European marriage pattern, this core family, father, mother, 1, 2, 3 children. no, not more.
Mm.
On the right,
Mm-hmm.
on the eastern side, you have kinships, great and huge families, as we find it until today in the Arabic world,
Mm-hmm.
for example.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
to prove that it existed just in the 7th, 8th century, in the early medieval times, is very difficult because we don't have the data. We don't have clear sources which we can use to prove it that this pattern existed just 1,000 years before. But I think, as even if we cannot prove it, I have not the sources. This must have been a very important factor for explaining the difference between the West and the East, because it explains why in the West there was social mobility more developed than elsewhere in the world. That in the
Mm-hmm.
West you have this possibility of competition. You have this social competition. At the end, it's good for inventions, for new discoveries, for a great art, and so on. No? So I think this is very important, and it's important because it's always even uh, against the rigid structures of feudalism. If you have somewhere in the society this liberty that the daughter of a potter doesn't marry the son of another potter, then you have the freedom that a potter daughter marries the daughter, marries the son of a poor merchant or a poor patrician. So
Mm-hmm.
the strata are mixed. This is good for um, social mobility. I think this is a point some we should discuss, but it's not a clear, proven development. I think we have not enough sources to decide whether I'm right, but I think it's an important point.
Mm. Yeah, no, I would agree. Yeah, so let's sit for a minute on feudalism, because I think feudalism is a well, it's super interesting in one sense, but I'll just put this in a sort of modern context. I mean, obviously, there's different parts of the world that have different elements, but even in the quote unquote developed world, some people have even made the kind of, I guess, tongue in cheek comment that we're kind of returning to a type of feudalism based on various oligarchy and massive wealth and income inequality, etc. Blah blah blah. I don't know how true that is, but it does give uh, feudalism a kind of bad kind of renaissance, to use the pun. But yeah, tell us, feudalism was became a massive element in Europe during the 12th century. I think some people put it in the 9th or 10th centuries at the beginning, but 12th century, you really see it in Europe, which is what you describe. Talk about how trading land for royalty with rapid expansion was a big part of many crises, rising with bad harvests. And then there's obviously the military component of it as well. And there's all these economic problems and social imbalances that happen. And this is pre, the plague and the Black Death and everything. So, what was the kind of, not again, I don't know if you're an economic expert, obviously, but, just historically from your lens, how do we get understanding the economics and the social components of what feudalism was for so long? And as you mentioned, this was the part of the downfall of the late Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Carolingian Empire. So this really had impact. To just kind of land here for a minute and talk to us about your perspective on feudalism in Europe in the 12th centuries and subsequently.
I think that's the most important point in my argument is that what was against feudalism, what was dissolving feudalism, um, starting just in the 13th, 14th century, I think urban societies. The urban society was, um, if you compare it with a feudalistic society, relatively liberal, relatively open.
Mm,
Feudalism, blood was important. Your family was important. And as I
mm,
said, in the European cities, from Florence to Stockholm and from London to to Frankfurt or Augsburg, my hometown, there was a society organized in a more horizontal way. I makes a difference in my book between vertical organization of a society against horizontal organization of a society. Horizontal means fraternities, craft societies, and so on, universities, and vertical is a feudal relationship between the lord and his feudal servant. No? So this was again a consequence of the fact that European development led to a development of free republics and free cities, relatively free cities, Florence, Venice, Siena, and so on. First in Italy, then sometimes in Germany, in other parts of Europe too. This horizontal principle was a European principle. You find it in European cities, for example, craft associations or fraternities, yes, as I said, but you cannot find it in many other parts of the world. The societies are, in a certain sense, feudalistic, organized till the medieval ages and early modern times.
Yeah, two pieces here. Kind of building on that. You mentioned I never really considered this actually, but you mentioned we sort of see in the kind of precursor, or even some ways in which we see today, you start to see these origins of universities rise in 1200 in Bologna and Paris. So Italy and France are kind of taking the lead here, and so now we're in the kind of pre-Renaissance era at this point, 13th century, but so universities, which is, I mean, we take that for granted nowadays, right? You teach at one, I teach at one, we just go and we teach and it's a whole thing. But there was a time where that didn't happen, or it didn't happen in the way that we see it today. There's an origin point to that of like anything else. And it is something pretty neat in a lot of ways, to go to a place to study and dialogue and all these things, be educated, to read. But you also talk about cities, courts, monasteries, cathedrals start to become these elements in the 12th century. And Italy and France start to really kind of become at the center. I guess in a kind of early pre-modern period of sorts, this is still dark ages, whatever people call it. Is there a reason why Italy and France kind of jump on the intellectual, cultural thought and start to produce this, as opposed to I don't know, Serbia and another country? Why Italy and France start to kind of do the lead up for what we see in the Renaissance?
It's a good question, but I would say that you don't find a necessary development. You cannot say it must have been in Italy or it went in France, but you can say this development had to develop in a world of economic prosperity, of merchants, of people selling houses and buying houses. So you need the security of your property. Yeah. So it was one of the very important preconditions. And Paris had the monasteries, as Bologna had. Monasteries means people, monks, which could read. This was a very important precondition. More, there were merchants selling, buying goods, and they need a jurisprudence, and they need security. And so you find some different factors, different conditions coming together, and then you find the individuals. Don't forget the importance of intelligent lawyers, humanistic, cultivated lawyers. know the
mm,
Roman law. They know the positive aspects of the Roman law, all what
mm,
the progress Roman law means compared to the older ways of deciding juridic cases. So you find lawyers, for example, Azzo Vercelli is a very famous lawyer, very intelligent lawyer, and one of the first really um, um, important commentators of the Roman law. So
mm,
you find the sentence chi non ha Azzo non vada al palazzo, chi non conosce Azzo non va al palazzo. Who doesn't know Azzo
mm,
and his jurisprudence shouldn't go to the palace of justice. So it's a condition to know Azzo's commentaries and to know the Roman system. And then, if you don't have this knowledge, you shouldn't go to the Palazzo of Justitia. No? So
mm,
you need individuals. You need always individuals, not only structures, not only conditions, not only a urban society with intense traffic between different centers of knowledge, with monasteries, with people able to read, to understand books, and to buy books, with the money to buy books, with the money to buy juridic books, with the money to hire um, lawyers.
mm,
Many factors come together, and but the chance that a university developed in a city like Bologna or Paris was um, much greater, much better than, for example, in Stockholm or in Tunis.
mm, mm, interesting. That's very, very, very interesting. I guess it's sort of the kind of updated question of why Greece, right? And so it's sort of the same. Well, why Italy and France? Well, just we've got one day we'll figure it out culturally. I just a footnote here, just because I don't want to skip it over, is you don't have to talk about it too much, but this was the period where we had the Mongol Empire, and it was a very big empire over. I mean, it was at the time the biggest. It was huge. It covered all over the steppe and into obviously Anatolia, which is modern day Turkey, and many other places, and stretching into Europe. I mean, what was there any impact or role of the Mongol Empire for pre-Renaissance Europe? I mean, again, any comments here on this?
I don't think so, but I think that the most important point was that it was possible to defend Europe against the Mongols. They were, they had, it was an empire where all these points I found so important for the Renaissance development, different centers, middle classes, and so on, didn't exist. And there was no
Mm,
freedom of discussion. The same you find in the Byzantine Empire. You don't
mm,
find innovations. You find an interesting reception of antique Roman texts, but you don't find new inventions, and you have not
mm,
these developments as you find it on the western side of the Hainal line. But in the
mm,
Mongol
mm,
Empire, I think you don't find intellectual stimulations which could be interesting for the Western development.
mm. Interestingly, that sounds right. Maybe less of intellectual development in one sense, but there is a. I mean, they were incredible administrators, which I think is. I mean, they did a lot of some horrible things too, but they were incredibly organized and good administrators for doing kind of localized government, which you see later in the Ottoman period, but much different. So before
That's
we
how there
come
was
on
only
to the,
uh,
go ahead. Yeah, go
again
ahead.
there was only one center, only one center,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and you didn't have a competition between different centers and different strata in the centers. It's always the same
Mm-hmm.
problem. No?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Before we come on to the Renaissance kind of head on, there is a sort of right at the beginning, and this sort of kind of is I guess you could say the preface, or dovetails right into the Renaissance fully of how people understand it and how you discuss in the book. Is this the origins of individualism kind of come here, 13th century, which was gaining much popularity, and that humanism starts to become this sort of revolutionary movement, engaging with critical philosophy of the Greeks and things we've chatted about already. Now, help me out here on this, because sometimes, I mean, granted, this was 800 plus years ago, so people are going to, update and think about things differently. Sometimes culturally or sociologically, especially here in the so-called West and the States and Canada, maybe Western Europe of sorts, the UK, things like that, there has been a bit of a pushback by certain folks of saying this whole individualistic versus collective cultures, blah, 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 all these things. And I understand some of that. I mean, these things are not, they're not this one-dimensional thing. It's not this kind of false dichotomy of sorts. And I think these can kind of be reductionistic arguments. But, can you explain how individualism at the time where it became popularity in the 12th century, why that was important historically in the context, and how you can see that it's not a versus, collectivism, but that it's a kind of it's not an either or, it's a both and, how you understand individualism and what that means for the human condition, for secular humanism, but also how you have that in tandem with understanding within your group or things like that. Tell us about the origins of this here, and how we see it kind of go further throughout time.
Yeah, first I had to say that you touch one of the most famous ideas about the Renaissance, Jakob Burckhardt's famous chapter about individualism in the Renaissance. He said that in the medieval times, people saw the world through only as a holy event, as a group of persons, and they had no individualistic ideas. This is, of course, in this form, it's not true. But we find that after the 12th, 13th century, first traces of a new conception of man. Humanism is just a result. But think about the point. For example, if you have your birthday, you open a bottle of champagne, I don't know, or you can meet with friends, you have a party. No? The first birthday party, or the first really mentioned birthday in the source, was in the 13th century. And then a point which was not discussed by Burckhardt, it's strange, but he didn't see that, or he forgot it to mention it. The fact that you find from the 13th, 14th century on, always more and more self-portraits or portraits of identifiable individuals. It's very interesting that you find just in the 13th century, find 1, 2, 3, then in the 15th, find just hundreds, the 16th, thousands and thousands. That's a very important point. No? So individualism, you can just prove in a quantitative dimension. This, I want to say, counting simply these paintings. And of course, humanistic philosophy puts man in the center of the discussion. Of course, God is not dead. Of course, he's not dead. But man gets a new role. The famous sentences of Pico della Mirandola in one of his most famous texts, that God says to Adam, I created you. You can be an animal and you can lose your dignity, fall down, or you can climb up to heaven. It's your freedom. It's your individual possibility, your individual possibilities. So humanism, and that's the reason why humanism is called humanism, means that the condition of man, and the condition not only of mankind, but of the individual, is in the center of a new philosophy, which is interested in discovering possibilities of the human life and saying this you can become much more as you are, and you have the freedom to move away from this poor sinner you have been in medieval times. This is obviously, I say it's not true if you say it this way. Even the medieval times had a positive conception of man, but you find a lot of texts saying that a man is a poor sinner and he is only depends on the will of God whether you can rise to eternity or fell down to hell. And this conception is losing um, its significance, its absolute significance, just in the Renaissance.
Mm, mm. Yeah, but so it's never again. It's a kind of a false dichotomy here. It's not in opposition to your kin group or your family or even still a religious group. It's this idea of you still have those things, but it's not. Again, historically, that was much different. It's how do we emphasize you as the individual, not neglecting that you're part of a group, not neglecting that you're part of a collective in some sense, but that you're not overemphasizing that you're emphasizing who you are as an individual, which is a makeup of all of those other things. Is this about right? Is this where this starts to take kind of some momentum here?
Yeah, but you have to be cautious because I think this absolute individual, the Superman, was an invention
Mm,
of the Renaissanceism of the late 19th
mm,
century, especially Nietzsche.
mm. Yeah, yeah.
If you study the sources of the 15th, 16th century, you don't find a Superman. You find
Mm, mm,
maybe un homo universale, un homo,
mm,
what that means, a man who is interested in many things, who is um, in many crafts, a good craftsman. For example, Leon Battista Alberti, the famous philosopher, said he was not only a good thinker, a good writer, a good artist, a good painter, a good sculptor. He says he could climb up as a sportsman and so on. So
mm,
you find, but it's a rare exception. Alberti
mm,
is the maybe the unique example of somebody
mm,
describing himself as a Superman or as a man on the other side, more than a normal
mm,
uh,
mm,
average people, no. But the
mm,
Superman, in the sense of Nietzsche, is an invention of later times.
mhm. Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
yeah.
clear that the Renaissance had a new conception of man. A man,
Mm,
of course, religious, of course, Catholic or Protestant,
mhm,
normally atheistic movements or atheistic thought is rare, absolutely rare, even in the
mm,
Renaissance.
mm,
Many few exceptions. One of the few, I think, is Leonardo da Vinci, but it's a discussion. It's
mhm,
not clear whether it's right what I presume. No? But
mhm,
you don't find atheism, but you find a new significance, a new importance of the life and the shape of man, the figure of the man.
mm, mm, yeah. So, we've done, an hour and a half of very elongated throat clearing, uh, if you will, and now we're finally at the Renaissance, right? So, tell us, all this lead up, I think, will really, much like your book does, give the Renaissance it sits, where it sits in time and history and place and all these things. So you have the start of the Renaissance in the 15th century, the 1400s, in Florence and Constance. How did you mentioned it earlier? Tell us about Renaissance art of Italy and how that moves through this process of cultural exchange and this massive troupe of patrons. Just kind of walk us into the Renaissance and not the high part. We're still early, but as it starts to begin in Italy and through art, tell us about the space in which this was operating there in the 15th century.
Yeah. In the 15th century, you find that antique architecture, the tradition, just in the so-called Proto-Renaissance in Florence, first traces of a never-forgotten culture. But you find that the antique ideas, the antique forms were built, churches, palaces, find not only the vault, the great, takes a great discovery of the Roman architecture, many details in the paintings reflect the knowledge of antique art and antique architecture. First, I think you have always the discovery of the antique texts. The first work was done by the humanists, by the writers. Then come the architects, and at the end the painters, because the painters need surfaces, they need walls where they can paint. And that means that the antique patterns, the antique forms become always more important. First in Florence and some other cities of central Italy, Urbino, Rimini, for example. And it was important to prove your knowledge of the antique as a symbol of your social status, as you today show that you understand something of modern culture. Buying, if you're rich, wealthy, you buy, let us say, not only a Picasso, but a modern painter, Ai Weiwei, for example, show and prove that you are a man of culture, not only of money, but of culture. People in the Renaissance tried to prove that they had the understandings and knowledge of antique aesthetics and antique forms. And so they engaged architects that were able to create antique architecture and painters. And so example, made Piero della Francesca and under the others' career.
Now, is it obviously the status piece is huge, but were there other motivations at this point of, to do some of these paintings or some of these sculptures or these architectural things? I mean, some of these things took years, months, years. The motivation couldn't have only just been obviously status, of course, but were there other things where they were more interested in the aesthete, right? And they were concerned about how they could leave something behind, or was there any of those types of motivations as well, or was it mostly primarily a status thing?
No, take an interesting example. It's a linear perspective. So the linear perspective, creating spaces on a surface, on a plane surface, no? Creating three-dimensional spaces. For us, it's nice to see, interesting to study Masaccio or other painters. But I would like to use a word, a notion created by the art historian Michael Baxendale, the period eye. The period eye means that every period has a certain way of perception. You see the world in a specific way. And if we see a three-dimensional movie, today you can, with artificial intelligence, The Lord of the Rings, huge, fantastic movies, and quite impressive, at least for elderly people as I am. But in the 15th century, it must have been sensational to see a three-dimensional space on a plane surface. No? So just a sensation. Masaccio created, or Piero della Francesca, who was a great mathematician too, made absolutely correct three-dimensional illusions. And of course, this was the first reason why he was estimated and highly paid. He got a lot of money for his paintings. No? And the same is valid for Alberti and for Leonardo and others, that they were able to create paintings very similar to reality. Today we have photos. Today it's not a sensation if you see a photo of 1,000 photos, 1,000 movies we see in the television every week. But in the 15th century, it was absolutely exceptional to see the illusionistic space. It's a famous Jan van Eyck, a Dutch painter. So we have, speaking about Italian Renaissance, we should speak about the exchange between the Netherlands and Italy too. With this famous Van Eyck created an altar with illusionistic space and landscape. There was the same effect as today a great pop concert with Madonna would have. No? His Madonna was another, but she was fascinating because people could see a real woman, a real space, a real landscape. The same was valid for Hieronymus Bosch with his fantastic ideas.
Oh,
No?
of course, yeah.
This you do, and this was one of the discoveries of the Renaissance. And it's interesting question, why the central perspective was invented at the same time when the humanistic philosophers made the man the center of their thought. The man, the person regarding a painting, looking to a painting, is the center of the perspective. The painting is made for him from a specific point of view, a certain point of view, then you have the real illusion of a space. So that's a new development. First example, early 15th century, Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And this was one reason why it was fascinating at the end to pay these artists and to buy their paintings, because they said, I have the money, I have the culture to afford a painting by Masaccio, for example.
Yeah, it's very fascinating how there's this craft of doing this. And look, I mean, you're right. We have today artificial intelligence. We have 3D. We have obviously, as they used to call it, moving pictures, films, all these things, all these different mediums and different technologies. But it feels like it's sort of a human kind of endeavor of sorts of doing these things. But I can still go to many of these places and go to these museums and still be stunned by stuff from the Renaissance period. I mean, I've seen some of I think it was in Belgium, I saw some of the stuff of the Dutch masters, and it was spectacular. I mean, I've obviously seen stuff in the Louvre and other places that, beautiful pieces from the Renaissance period in Italy and in France. So, we still marvel at it. We still, even though we've quote unquote, modern and postmodern or whatever, there is still a sort of, I don't want to be super dramatic about it, but there is an eternal quality to it. I mean, you can still see it and see like, wow, like, there is something spectacular here, which I think is really interesting about their quality through time, which again, maybe also speaks to their sense of culture, having culture and high culture, and their sense of status and things like that. You can still kind of see like, wow, like this is really, really, incredible in that way.
And here you have again the effect of competition, of social competition between the patrons. The patrons want to have wonderful paintings on the one side. On the other side, you have the painters, and one painter tries to be better than the other one. Leonardo da Vinci was able to paint a landscape with his famous sfumato, with his without showing one line, one trace of his of his
a brush or
his
a
work.
pen or whatever he was
Yeah,
using, his
of
utensil.
his
Yeah,
pen. Yeah, right.
yeah.
And the competition between the patrons, competition between the cities and the city republics was very, very important for the development of a new naturalistic, supernaturalistic form of painting and the variety of the different forms to paint, for example, a Madonna. In the
Mm,
13th, 12th century, it was a sign of quality if you have been able to paint the Madonna as it was painted by St. Luke, the first
mm,
Madonna painting, legendary painting by St. Luke, the painter. So it
mm,
was a direct uh, mirror of the real Madonna. And so
mm,
it was important to copy always this first painting. In the Renaissance, they developed always new forms of Madonna. Rubens, Titian, Leonardo, they always painted different forms of Madonna. The Madonna
mm,
with flowers, with animals, the Madonna with a child, and so on and so on. And this is a mirror of a complicated art market. And this art market was very European, by the way, very Dutch. And the Dutch art market was, I think, maybe sometimes more important than the Italian one.
mm,
And this art market, many, many paintings are lost, of course, but many famous have survived. And
mm,
this art market is, of course, uh, it's a reflection of the prosperity of the cities, of the city, not only the middle classes, but always middle classes too, not only the wealthy patrons. Nice Madonna painting, even a craftsman could pay. No? The prices were not
mm,
so absolutely high. And
mm, mm,
so this variety of the arts reflects a variety in the society, and the
mm.
variety of the patronage of the great monasteries, of the great uh, bishop palaces, of the great cities.
Do you think that this, if you will, variance or diversity of different artists and different people having the kind of healthy competition, etc., do you think that that is sort of the origins or kind of birth of how we see artists today? That
Yeah,
they compete with their writing, they with film, with still fine art, with digital art. Do you really, is that sort of the birthplace of where we really see that continues until today?
yes, absolutely. So I
Yeah.
think that Isabella d'Este, she was Duchess of Mantova, said to her agent, to one of her agents, she wants to have a Leonardo, a painting by Leonardo.
Mm,
It's not important what it is representing, what it shows, and the price is not important. He pays whatever what he wants. This is the first example for a very modern way to see art. And they wanted, as you say, it was a very vivid, very interesting market for works of arts, where to be better, to be different from the concurrence was important. Competition
mm,
was in the center, as it is today. And the work of art, sometimes there were agents, mediators, and they made a lot of money uh, making artists great and selling the art of as today. If you have a good gallery, then you if a gallery is important. Galleries say what a work of art is worth. No?
mm-hmm,
If you
mm-hmm.
have
Yeah.
an important gallery as an artist, you can make a lot of money. And this
Mm-hmm,
is starting in the 15th century too, when you find the first agents. Until the 16th, 17th century, still the great majority of people we call artists have been simple craftsmen. They were
mm,
members of guilds, and they
mm,
were paid, for example, for a great altarpiece was the dimension and the number of the represented figures. That was simply a work of craftsmanship, not a work of art, as we would say today. But just these works of craftsmanship were paid and estimated like today works of art. So we see just a first glimpse to a modern world of art.
That's a nice point. So, we mentioned it earlier, but Gutenberg printing press, tremendous for the world. But how? Okay, let me put it this way. This might be too much, but you tell me. Do you think the Renaissance could have been as big as it was and impactful as it was without the printing press? Asked another way, how consequential was the Gutenberg Press for the Renaissance?
Not only the Renaissance, but the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
I think that without the printing press, no scientific revolution. And, by the way, without scientific revolution, no industrialization. A different modern world. I won't say it's not a worse modern world, but it's another modern world which could have been created or developed without the printing press. Why? Take the history of the Copernican revolution. It is a very, very long way where many authors, many astronomers participated, writing studies, criticizing what Copernicus discovered, and improving what he discovered. Kepler, for example, discovered the elliptical way. The planets have not a circle line, but they have an elliptical way. And then Newton's gravity, theory of gravity. And they always could learn from the books of the others. Newton read books published via Gutenberg's press, books by Kepler. And if you read today Kepler's book, the new Astronomia Nova, I tried to read it. It's in Latin. I understand Latin a little bit. I learned it in school. But the mathematics and the astronomy is far away from my knowledge. And if you are not an expert, you don't understand what this book really, what the significance of this book really was. Newton was a reader who understood it, who could see that this was a book, a revolutionary book, with a real same dimension as a Copernican De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. And so he invented a new theory and made a new theory of gravity. And without Newton, no cell phone, no satellites, no Elon Musk with his rockets. Maybe. And so I think that the Gutenberg revolution was really important because you have not only a small group of monks or scientists reading a manuscript written with handwriting, maybe illustrated, maybe wonderful, maybe copied 10, 12 times, but you read thousands and thousands of books and you have thousands and thousands of participants at a grand dialogue, thousands and thousands of possible people who can criticize what another man has written, or people who could improve what you find. So I think it's extremely important. You have a possibility of dialogues between Copenhagen and Moscow, and Stockholm and Rome, and Florence and Naples, and so on. This dialogue would have been impossible without the printing press. And if you look to the great discoveries from Newton to the steam engine, from Copernicus to the new astronomy of Newton, without the printing press, impossible.
Yeah. It's something I take for granted. I think a lot of people do, but it's incredible. It's incredible. I think I started to recognize a little bit of it, just 2% maybe, where during the pandemic, I think in 2020 or maybe early 21, where there was a lot of backlog on publishers. They weren't able to print as many books, and there were delays. And I said, "Oh, I mean, sure, people get things digitally, but I mean, I still read things physically. So, but I was like, oh, that wouldn't be good if we just weren't able to print as many books anymore. And then how it, and I never really, and I really had a moment where I was like, oh, there was a time where people didn't have the ability to go buy a book and read
Yeah.
ideas and all these things. And I think your point is established. You're not going to get all of these thinkers at the time that, had access to it and were able to then make better discoveries and keep improving. So it's definitely not under shouldn't be understated for sure.
And it's interesting that you don't find the printing press with screw press
Mm, mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm,
movable types. So the essential parts of the Gutenberg invention in other cultures. In the Islamic
mm,
cultures, you don't find it. In China, you don't find it. And
mm,
until the 19th century, in Turkey, people communicated via manuscripts. So
mm-hmm,
that's a
mm-hmm,
great difference. And one reason why the uh, uh, velocity of inventions in the West was more rapid than elsewhere.
mm. Yeah, that's a good point. So, kind of two things here together. I mean, there's obviously the what's going on during the Renaissance. So this is 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th into 18th century. Uh, there's also other things going on in the world, of course. And you mentioned in the book, Spain, of course, goes abroad at the end of the 15th into the 16th century, and Columbus, 1492, the whole thing, and then many explorers, and there was this trying to find a new world. I guess these finding new worlds, did this impact the Renaissance movement in Europe? So folks back home, where you talk about in the high Renaissance, there was this emphasis on distant worlds of dreams, and you talk about this in Ovid and Homer and Virgil and all these things, but that the Renaissance was the high Renaissance, the peak of it, of sorts, if you will. There was this fascination on utopia and distant worlds, and was there a bit of where it's a kind of a moment of the time, right? If you have the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish, and sailing the world and trying to find other new worlds in different places. Are we seeing that back in Europe in the Renaissance with this emphasis on world of dreams and utopia? And you mentioned very nicely in this way and somewhere in the book about we see the ungodly in Da Vinci, as you kind of mentioned, and the divine in Michelangelo and Raphael. How do we understand these kind of big themes and concepts in the high Renaissance period in the 16th century?
Yeah, you are absolutely right. The central point is that this utopia and these wonderful worlds of people living in under a blue sky and with fruits and free love and so on, that this were worldly paradises. So not a paradise in the future after the last judgment and in eternity, but on real societies on a distant island. And it's not a case that the utopia, Thomas More's utopia, was inspired by the so-called discoveries by Columbus and by Amerigo Vespucci and others. No, so the Montaigne, I love Montaigne. If you read my Montaigne
Mm-hmm.
chapter, I'm
Yeah,
very
yeah.
fond of his philosophy. He was the
Mm-hmm.
first who said, "Let us look to the Native Americans." It doesn't say Indians, as far as I see. It's Native Americans living in this bay, which is so far distant from ours, and we are killing ourselves. We have our wars, and they try to live in peace. No? And
Mm-hmm.
this positive view, the um, starting a tradition you find its enlightenment until today. The dreams of a far distant, peaceful world. This is a development of the Renaissance, and it has to do with the discoveries, so-called discoveries, we have to say. Of course, We know that the so-called discovery of the Americas was not always positive for the native inhabitants. It's another discourse. But it happened. And it
Yeah,
happened
yeah, absolutely.
because the Europeans were curious, because they could
Yeah.
read antique texts about distant islands,
Mm-hmm.
Atlantis, for
Mm-hmm.
example.
Mm. Well, talk about though about this idea thematically that there's that, but yeah, the ungodly in Da Vinci and the divine in Michelangelo, and I guess other lesser known pieces as well. You can talk about them, but you can also talk about lesser known artists or lesser known things. I mean, you spend many chapters in the book, or excuse me, many pages talking about some of these figures. If you want to use some as an illustrative example of really the color and the essence of what the high Renaissance produced. These are the two main figures that many people will know, but maybe some lesser known figures or other works of art that you could use to illustrate some of the in a sense the genius of the Renaissance period and the high part.
Yeah, of course, the word high Renaissance is a concept of art history, and it describes the trias Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. No, it's a famous climax of the Renaissance, and of course, harmony, absolute symmetry. No, there's a person in the center, right and left. But you find just if you read Piero della Francesca or Alberto, he wrote a treatise on perspective, or you read Alberti's theory of colors, you find just the beginnings of this development. You find that they
Mm,
attempt to find harmonic colors and to organize laws how to combine colors. You find laws how to construct a painting, and
mm,
I think that's a essential part of the so-called high Renaissance in painting. Is this absolutely uh, uh, I emphasized painting according to rules
mm,
of colors, to rules of symmetry, to proportions, certain proportions you find in the architecture. Takes a high Renaissance architecture. We have an architecture too, from Michelangelo to Palladio, from Alberti to Scamozzi and many other architects. You find just the attempt, that's very characteristic, to construct proportions according to celestial, to metaphysic uh,
mm,
combinations of numbers. The
mm,
5 to 3, the octave, or 2 to 1, and so on. So Whitcover showed in Architectural Principles of the Renaissance, a famous book, showed and proved that it was the idea to show a part of the celestial harmony, the eternal harmony of God in the construction of a building on earth.
mm,
And Palladio, famous Venetian architect in Upper Italy, Northern Italy, uh, influential, as you know, in Washington D.C. to White House to many other parts of the world. He
yeah.
tried to realize what the theory wanted, to show a part of the celestial harmony, the eternity of God's uh, aesthetics. This is,
Mm,
I think, that's high Renaissance, and you find this
mm,
high Renaissance from Vicenza in Italy to Washington D.C.
hmm. Yeah. It's it's interesting because kind of we were talking about all the things previously. You really see, historically there's some if you will scientific revolutions here, but meaning namely the printing press and other things, but you kind of see all of there's a culmination of sorts of uh different ideas and culture and peoples and things like that from all different times of history. And there's this kind of it feels there's a lead up to this point of, okay, now we've and not to say that anything was perfect or whatever, obviously not, but we've figured out how to do a little bit of organizing society. It's not perfect. There's issues, but we're not necessarily going hungry, and we're not famine all the time. Again, there's always war, there is famine, there's plague, but that this period was a time of, yeah, we can build on all of these ideas and start to create in these ways to show these ideas. And that it seems successively, although not maybe so specific, not linear, that everything's kind of building on each other. So by the time you get to the 16th century and into the 17th, you see basically a kind of building of sorts of whatever the previous people did and all these things. And look, let's not say that there wasn't great things in the Roman or Byzantine period or things like that. I mean, you could take stuff like other buildings, synagogues, mosques that were built previously, and they're beautiful. So it's not unique to the Renaissance necessarily, but that there's this culmination of trying to find this pushing of structure and art and science and humanity that really seems to kind of climax or culminate in this point. And then out of it, you see all of these things, or not all, but many of the things that we see in modernity as you're saying, we talked about the printing press, we talked about architecture, we talked about art, we talked about that. Yeah, I can go into DC, or you could go to New York, or you can go to London, or you can go to wherever, and you can see the imprint of many of the things out of the Renaissance on things in our modern world. Is that a fair assessment of saying the impact that the Renaissance has had from this period of what was going on there, or is that too much to put into it?
No, I think it's not. It's nice. It's nice to find the impact of Palladio in
Mm.
America or in South America, everywhere in the
Mm-hmm.
world, and
Mm.
it's. I think more important, and not only positive, but more important, to speak about the Socratic dialogue and the fact that the Renaissance was important to introduce this way of discussing and thinking in the Western world. No?
Mm.
It's sometimes I would say it's not so easy to say it's positive or negative. It's
Mm-hmm.
modern art, for example, modern architecture. Takes a postmodern architecture. Take Sir Norman Foster. Take many others. Um, Zaha Hadid is a total or opposite against the harmony of the Renaissance. And the modern art is an answer to all the Renaissance created.
Yeah.
And then I could say, defending the Renaissance, that one of the most important points, and that's the reason why I wrote it at the end of my book, is the fact that the Renaissance was able to criticize the old patterns, the old tradition,
Mm.
to say,
Mm.
okay, Aristotle had some good ideas, but he was in many other things completely wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Or to say that the Galenic medicine is very useful, but the system of the four humus, the humoral pathology, is nonsense. And this nonsense, no, or astronomy. Is astronomy useful to understand future? Of course not. Until today, there are some people who believe that is helpful. Or not the point whether astronomy is nonsense or not, but the point that I'm discussing that, the point that I'm criticizing this, that I'm criticizing my own thoughts, my own society.
Mm.
I think that the Western society is until today the great strength in our democracies that we are able to criticize our system, to criticize what our government is doing or not doing, or to
Mm.
emphasize what they are doing or not doing, and to understand that we are not correct in our governments or parliaments in many things they are doing and saying. And if we are right, we have applause, and if not, we are criticized ourselves. And this process is a renaissance discovery, and that's the most important one.
Yeah, I 110% agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I think that is such a to me a fundamental component of being a human in the modern world is to be able to do that. And I think that is the thing that is worth fighting over and disagreeing over, is giving the people, especially when they disagree with you, especially is in some ways, in terms in the world of art, you have, yeah, as you were mentioning, I mean, I love modern art, but modern art is critiquing and in dialogue with all of the art that came before it. Maybe not all of it, but definitely preceding it, and vice versa. And what you're saying, the Renaissance was doing this, is to be able to critique this, and that's how you get better. That's how you improve. That's how you create. That's how you progress. That's how you move forward. And critique, I would say, or dialogue and critique in a constructive way, not to just be cynical or pessimistic, although there might be components of that. To find to critique and to give constructive dialogue in a way to build better or to progress further in a better way. I think there are many great things about places all over the world and people groups all over the world, but I think where we have seen where many societies thrive is when they have a healthy element of being able to do that. That's not to say that other places that don't have that don't thrive or are not great, but I think that there's a really instructive component of being able to do that. You also, again, we mentioned it before, I'll just say this here, you had a really nice bit somewhere 3/4 into the book of sorts, where you talk about the might of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm a little bit curious here for your thoughts on this. So as the Renaissance is going on, Ottoman Empire starts 1299, Osman, et cetera. And so by the time you get to the 16th century, it's at the might of the kind of the middle Ottoman period. And you say that Ottomans developed a sophisticated bureaucracy, a treasury with the spoils of war, and they had arrangements with local leaders, which I think is one of the most compelling things about the Ottomans. Of course, you have Suleiman the Magnificent, 16th century. He was, again, everyone's got their pros and cons, but there's many wonderful things about Suleiman in the 16th century. And you talk about how Istanbul became a very large city at the center of politics, economics, culture, artists, scholars, craftsmen. So what was the kind of, again, not that far away, if you have France and Italy as sort of the center points of the Renaissance, where do you fit Istanbul and maybe to a larger extent the Ottomans, but do they not fit under the Renaissance, or are they just a adjacent traveler alongside the Renaissance in the 16th and 17th century? Where do you see their place here, understanding their importance and their might at this period?
I think I'm not an expert for Ottoman history, but I think that I never want to say that the Renaissance and the aesthetics of the Renaissance, the quality of the Renaissance architecture and so on, as a measure for everything. And I do want to emphasize that I don't see the art history as a development from the less quality to highest quality in the higher Renaissance, and then a decline maybe. No, that's not the point. So I think that the Ottoman architecture, impressive as you know better than me, knowing Istanbul, and that this architecture is fascinating, great, but it's a different taste and a different goal, different kind of public audience. So
mm,
we have
mm,
more art important for religion and for the power of the Sultan, not this very differentiated, very multiple kind of art market we find in the West. I think,
mm,
do not know very good the Ottoman situation, but
mm.
I would say we should take other measures, other criteria to understand what Ottoman art and Ottoman culture was.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, that's a nice way of framing it. I think that yes, when I've talked to folks that do study the Ottoman Empire, especially the Middle Ottoman, I would say there is a sort of my read. I could be wrong on this, but there is a. I think you're right. A different audience, a different obviously history and things like that. But there is a sort of yeah, I think there's an adjacent or parallel kind of thing going on. The Renaissance is going on maybe Central West Europe, but Ottoman had their own period of also creating lots of wonderful art and culture and things like that. So it's very interesting to see at the same time that there's these things going on. And I'm sure as well, if you look to maybe India or China or things like that, I don't know, maybe further
Yeah.
east you see that. But at the time, the Ottoman Empire was massive. Now
I think
you spend.
you can.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think one point is the Renaissance and many other cultures and the Ottoman Empire have in common. Power, real
Mm-hmm.
power, wants to present itself. But
Mm-hmm.
the Sultan uh, makes Topkapi an impressive, very impressive palace. And
Mm-hmm.
so a small duke like Federico da Montefeltro takes all
Mm-hmm.
his money to build a huge palace. Power always wants to be huge and to show, to represent itself. Louis XIV, Ludwig the 14th, Louis the 14th is a wonderful example how he can show his power with huge architecture of Versailles and with gold everywhere. The same new president is trying to do now in the Oval Office.
Yeah, it's uh all, all I will say about the current of the United States president is that there is an attempt that is there, but in my mind it's sort of the McDonald's version of things of trying to do that. So anyways, so um so you spend a long chapter, is an important one, on the all important Luther. Granted, he's got his own issues and troubles and things like that, but obviously he was super important for the Protestant faith, and further I think for Europe. How was he important for the English Reformation and for the Renaissance movement at the time in this period?
Yeah. No, he was, of course, he was extremely important for Northern Europe, for England. And you know that he didn't organize to begin a reformation, a reform of the Catholic Church, but separation. The result of the Reformation were many churches, many different churches, not only a positive development. And he was not a great friend of the arts. That's another discourse. He was not a great friend of the Jews. If you take a famous text by him, die Lud von den Juden und ihren Lügen, about the
Hmm.
Jews and their lies, that's the first step to Auschwitz.
Yeah.
It's the first step to anti-Semitism, to modern
Hmm.
anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
That doesn't change the fact that many of his critiques at the Roman Church were justified and were correct. Yeah. And that the
Hmm.
Reformation had a historical right. And it was important for my book because the Reformation, in a certain sense, was the end of the Renaissance. religion became more important again. And so the Renaissance is separated by Reformation and Counter-Reformation from Enlightenment. That means we have a development to Enlightenment starting in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, then the Reformation changing everything, and the Enlightenment starting after the wars of religion. A horrible lesson. If you think that alone in the German world, the 30 Years' War had more than 2 or 3 million deaths. Horrible.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is but Luther was important in a negative way and in a positive way, of course. History is always complicated. That's a problem.
Well, before we get to the counter-revolution real quick, I just want to say, you talk about the Habsburgs and how that conglomerate kind of crumbled due to strategic overstretch. What was the kind of circling around, I guess, during the Renaissance period of the Habsburgs and their sort of, I don't want to say fall, but they do splinter and crumble. What was? I mean, they were also a big empire of sorts. How do you see their kind of position here as well in this period?
Of course, the Habsburg Empire was of absolutely primary importance. It was a world power. Just in the 16th and 17th centuries, with the colonies, the empire of Charles V was an empire where the sun never set, as people described it. No, very important as a negative, in a negative sense, because the rise of European states, of the republics, of the monarchies, of the continent, from France to the Swiss Confederation, was always a rise in a certain sense against Spanish imperialism. Spain was a negative enemy for many European leaders. And so it was not only a cultural power and a religious power of primary importance, but it was a negative enemy. And in this sense, it was important for the development of nation states, national states. So let us say the early forms, the embryos of later nation states. Think in England, for example, the Armada battle in 1588. This was one moment when the British nation was born, as we know the British Empire in this 19th century. So you have to start 1588.
It's very, very, very peculiar here to see how there's all these turns, right, and all these kind of waves of how things go as things move. So tell us about this counter kind of revolution here, of course. So the scientific revolution, after the Reformation, has many scientists, and reason again became central for the Enlightenment, things like that. And you talked about this long taming of religion with the massive upheavals of the scientific revolution, and then following it, the Industrial Revolution, which the Industrial Revolution probably takes us close to the 20th century. I would say, it's 1800s, 1900s. So how do we see this sort of based on where the Renaissance sits in history? We start to see afterwards this sort of dance between how do people now use reason and scientific method and all of these other type, critical dialogue with also religion as well. And they, and people have talked about this a lot, they're in opposition, they're not, they can cohabitate together, whatever. But we start to see this sort of dance. How is the Renaissance place for that? In the immediate kind of aftermath of the end of the Renaissance, we see the ripple effects of what the Renaissance gave, and then how sort of after we see that dance between science, reason, dialogue with kind of religion as well. What is the kind of impact there of this?
Yeah, I think if you want to understand the, the invention of the steam engine, then you have to go back to the first attempts the Greek world made with power, with the power of steam. So you will discover that in Alexandria there were different experiments, attempts to use the power of steam. By the way, very interesting that the Romans didn't see the military possibilities the power of steam had. It's an interesting point. Why not? Why not the intelligent
Mm-hmm.
military
Mm-hmm.
state? The Romans didn't see that. But if you see that the history of the power of steam goes back 2,000 years, or the history, another example I wanted I discussed in my book, the invention of the screw.
Mm-hmm.
The screw. First example you find reading Leonardo, and then it was reinvented because Leonardo never published his inventions. Then try to construct an engine without screws.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
much, I say, it's much more interesting for the development of capitalism, industrialized capitalism, than all Protestant ethics. So Max Weber, the idea by Max Weber that the Protestant ethics were so important for the development of capitalism. No, the screw was more important, a very small object. No, but uh, to understand all these things, this is a basic idea. You have to go far away back to the past to understand the scientific revolution. Without scientific revolution, no steam engine. Without steam engine, no industrial revolution, as I said before. Without industrial revolution, another modern world.
So I guess when we think about all of the things the Renaissance gave us, before and then certainly after, what would you say, or why is there the longevity and you could say success of the West so impactful in the world today? Another way, I mentioned this earlier, but how did the European Renaissance, produce this gargantuan range of thought and ideas and exchange through time that the rest of the world benefited from and still benefits from? So tell us, I guess the Renaissance giving us sort of this longevity of the West, a concept we still, I would say, live in and reside in, and people still talk about. How does it have its tentacles into 2025, even still today?
I had to give a lecture some month ago about the future. Historians are prophets of the past. We are not able to say what will happen in 200 years.
Right.
And I spoke about China and the development of China. By the way, my book has been translated into Chinese too.
Oh, very
And
nice.
yeah, two volumes in Chinese. And I said maybe a small quantum of solace or a little bit light of hope for me is that the positive developments in the economy, inventions, Nobel Prizes, and so on, always happened in democratic societies. So democracy, tolerance are two factors of huge importance for developments in economy, inventions, and so on. And so I would say that maybe after 23, 30 years, we'll understand that the Chinese model, the Chinese development, the Chinese model won't work. This successful way, we now presume it will go ahead. Possible that the West, not the global South, if you have a look to the so-called global south, you find dictatorships, corrupt governments, and no democracies. Few exceptions. That then, in the long run, democracy could win the competition. It's, as I said, as a historian, I'm not a prophet, and I'm not sure whether I will be right, but we can speak about that again in after 200 years. Then you will see whether I'm right or not.
Let me just ask about that, I guess, a little bit. Is sure you're no prophets here, but right now, I guess in the world, I agree with you. I think for the most part, although there are, as a fan of democracy, and U.S. has a kind of democracy. It's not a direct democracy, representative, blah blah blah. But okay, what China is doing and has been doing for the past 25, 30 years is, I mean, the marvel of the world at the moment in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology, in terms of development, in terms of people go to China. I haven't been. I don't know if you have either, but people go to China and they say it's like going 20 years in the future now. Like that's what it feels like. And then you come back to the rest of the world and you're like, we're still doing all these things. And listen, I love my country. I love the United States, but the United States is behind Europe on some things by 25 years. So, it's insane how the world, and you're right, the global South, many African countries, many Latin American countries, yes, they're bogged down in all of these strong men, authoritarian, blah blah blah, and not all, but I see in China this production. They are creating, they are producing, and they are pushing very fast into the 21st century. Now, let's be honest here, right? Their human rights issues are a challenge, of course. I think the U.S. has human rights issues, and other places around the world have human rights issues. So, okay, but there's some issues there. They have basically, their country is run by a board of the Communist Party, so on and so forth. There are certainly huge issues there. They're what they do with climate, on and on and on. But considering those things, they are creating and they are producing and they are building, and the rest of the world does not seem to be doing that. Western Europe has its issues. The Central and Eastern Europe has issues. Obviously, Russia is where it's at now. The United States has many challenges. So when you look on the world and where it's going now, not 200 years, right now, China seems to be, and look, listen, I'm by no means, I'm not sympathetic to communism or authoritarianism. I don't know how you govern a country of 1.3 billion people, but I don't know if direct democracy is the way. But how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of right now? There is a lot of the positive aspects of what China is doing for technology and modernization, or in some ways a future kind of component, infrastructure, buildings, all these things, creating elements of jobs. What do we do with that? How do we say, yes, I agree with you, democracy has allowed for a lot of these things for many hundreds of years, but maybe there's a shifting, maybe there's a moving of sorts here in some ways. What do you think?
I said it's only a small light of hope. Only it's a small light of, because it's easier. Of course, it's easier for an authoritarian government, for a mighty secretary to decide what should be topic of research, where should we invest money?
Yeah.
Should we abolish vaccination because it creates autism? Or should we do other things? This is right that from one moment to the other, authoritarian regime can foster certain things and bring and with a lot of money create new infrastructures and so on. But historical experience shows that on the long run, you need creative individuals. So you need unorthodox ideas. You need competition. You need open societies, and that you have not. You need the liberty of thinking to say what you're thinking about the politics of the government, and the politics of a government saying you have to do this or that research. No? So on the long run, there's the chance that the advantage of the democratic system is too attractive. In the Arabic Revolution a long time ago, it was attractive for a moment. And history shows that things change.
Yeah,
Patterns, behavior
I
change.
agree with. I do agree with you. In the long view, I think that's right, and I agree with the glimmer of hope there. There's a small window. I guess the last question here is you say this at the end, which I thought was nice. You say that there's the great divergence led to the great convergence, which maybe produced global modernization. Again, just to finish here, how do you think throughout in your very magisterial book that you wrote, how do we see all of what came before the Renaissance that informed it, the centrality and the usefulness of the Renaissance and everything after it? How does all of that kind of really continue to have relevance for us today in some of the ways we talked about, maybe in other ways that why studying it and understanding it is helpful for us globally of where we are, today and where we want to go?
Yeah. First, very simple. You go to a museum. Go to a museum. Have a look to Leonardo. Have a look to the Leonardo da Vinci in the National Gallery, Washington D.C. Is a fantastic Ginevra Benci. And then you have a happy moment. Sometimes you are in another world. You have the freedom to think about that. You have freedom to enjoy the beauty of a painting and to know something about its history. That's studying another culture, another time can be very, very good for your psychic life, for your spirit. No? That's very simple. That's a power of history, the power of the aesthetics of old art. No? It's one point. Then, as I said, and sometimes we spoke about that now, you can learn how important and how unique the discovery of the free discourse has been until today and should remain. This central point mediated from antique times via Renaissance to our times. This is for me, and then tolerance, humanism, and as one of the great discoveries of the period, the human rights, as a great discovery of the Enlightenment, but prepared in the thinking of the Renaissance. These are a heritage we shouldn't forget, and we should always try to communicate to our contemporaries. And you saw my small glimpse of hope comes from the study of a long, long history of inventions, innovations, and the development of democratic societies. So let us hope that this small glimpse will sometimes be a little bit more realistic than it seems to be today.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. Bernd, what can I say? You've given me almost 3 hours of your time and energy and wisdom and knowledge and I'm very grateful for that. But somehow it doesn't feel quite enough to do justice to 1,200 pages. So I highly recommend listeners, if they really enjoyed this wonderful conversation with you, to get the full deep dive in your fabulous book, which is just a feat. And if I can do something even half of this, where I can write a book and was so rich in information detail and leave that behind, when I'm gone from this earth, that would be, something special. So you should feel super proud of what you've done here. It's really a fabulous standard into the canon of Renaissance history. So big thanks for coming on and for all your wisdom and your generosity and your kindness. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks again for the invitation. I'm very proud to have been your guest. Thank you for the discussion and all the best.